Hello and welcome to the Tony Hernandez Show. It's Saturday, November 6, 2013, and the winter mists are starting to come into the air. The NFC North is in a conflicted position and has gone amiss, and patriots are spreading brush fires of freedom through the minds of men in the state of Minnesota. So that said, our regularly broadcasted host is missing today because he's currently embarking on the American tradition of football, a subject that we've covered in the past. Today we have a few eclectic topics that I'd like to cover with a buddy of mine that I'll introduce to you in a second here. We'll discuss topics as diverse as nullification, the Tea Party movement in the United States, the NFC North as it's unfolded in the last few weeks, and various other topics including UFC 167 between St. Pierre and Hendricks tonight. So that being said, I'd like to introduce a friend of mine that graciously has joined me today, and that would be none other than Jake Duesenberg here. Jake's an economic mind, a financial advisor, and a connoisseur of knowledge when it comes to the political aspects of this state. So thanks for joining, Jake.
Thank you very much. I thought you only had me on for the NFC North topic.
It's always good to have Jake on for the NFC North because we find ourselves diametrically opposed. So that being said, today I invited Jake specifically to talk about book reviews. So both Jake and I are avid readers, and we've been justly influenced by several writings that's inspired us in our work and in our efforts. That being said, we're going to take some time just to go through some brief 1-minute reviews on books of our choice and say how they've influenced us. I will predominantly cover historical topics, and Jake will do the same with economic topics. It reflects our interests accordingly. That being said, I would like to start by talking about one of my favorite books on American history, and that is The Founding Fathers' Guide to the Constitution. This book was written by Brian McClanahan, who is an expert on the state ratification conventions, and this book is particularly compelling because it delves into both the mentalities of the Federalist proponents of the Constitution and the Anti-Federalist opponents of the Constitution. You have to understand the views of both factions that developed during the course of the ratification conventions to really understand what the Constitution meant, and that is the most powerful aspect of this book to me. So that being said, let's give Jake a try here. Jake brought one of my favorite books to start off with, and that is F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom. So why is that a compelling book to you, Jake?
Hayek's a very good author, someone I've read a lot of. This book in particular, if someone wanted to delve into a topic that talks about real politics or real problems with large government, this is the foremost book on that subject. Hayek writes about why centralized economic planning, or actually centralized planning in general, are bad for society, and he makes very compelling arguments in this book, and how when you put so much reliance on government, you lend your liberties or give up your liberties to a government that wants to take them from you. Very good book. I would highly recommend to anyone that wants to read more on that subject.
And me as well. In fact, Jake, that's actually my favorite of the books that you brought in today. That is particularly interesting, especially to people that are just learning about the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. Yeah. So that being said, I guess it's my turn again, and I'm going to talk about America's Virginian Revolution, and this was written by one of my favorite authors of American history named Kevin Gutzman. Kevin is an expert on the Virginia Ratification Convention and really an expert of the founding period of the United States. And what I thought is most interesting about this book is it really breaks down probably the most important ratification convention, that of Virginia. And I say that because the political elite in Virginia was completely split between determining whether to authorize the Constitution or to disavow it. In fact, we know that George Washington, Edmund Randolph, and James Madison were avid supporters of the Constitution, but there's this little-known guy named Patrick Henry, which was a big opponent of it, and George Mason, who sometimes we refer today as the father of the Bill of Rights. That being said, Virginia's supporters of the Constitution made it known that the Constitution, and this is the words of Edmund Randolph, only had the powers which were expressly delegated to it. That's the wording he used. A secondary supporter of the Constitution named George Nicholas described the Constitution as being a compact of individuals. So that being said, this is a particularly powerful book in understanding that convention. Jake, now you brought a second book by Henry Hazlitt, who's also another Austrian economic mind.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about that one.
Okay, I didn't put a lot of time and thought into the books that I brought today. I just grabbed 5 of the quickest, most important ones off my desk. But if anyone wants to see some books on economics, this would always be the one that I'd recommend first. And this is really an introduction to economics, something that a lot of people probably didn't learn in their schools. And one of the greatest parts about this book is it breaks down the fallacies of what we call the broken window fallacy. The fallacy is the broken window fallacy. That's too many fallacies. Why the broken window fallacy is not true, and it's a really good book. I think it's written in a very basic way so that most people, even without an economic past, can understand it. And so, this and the next book I'll talk about would be always on my top 2 and books for people if they want to get interested in economics.
Sure, and those are important types of books, ones that introduce people to topics that they may have not otherwise learned about. Yeah. So that's a good point. For my next one, I'd like to talk about Raoul Berger's Government by Judiciary. This is, in my estimation, the best book on United States constitutional law in the entire field. And I say that because Berger goes directly to the state ratification conventions for explanations on not only the Constitution's ratification, but the amendments which were added later. And this is especially important because he attacks what's called the incorporation doctrine in this book. The incorporation doctrine is one that espouses that the Bill of Rights are restrictions placed on not only the federal government, which is how it was made to be, but also on the state governments. But Berger attacks that because really, people that propose such things say that the 14th Amendment did that, but that's not consistent with the ratification of the 14th Amendment, and the federal courts did not claim it did that until the 1930s, like 60 years after it. So I think this is an incredible book that really gets into how powerful the federal judiciary has gotten to be, and that is one of the most important principles that we can learn about in America today. That being said you had another book that you may actually advise new people to economics to take a look at. Let's talk about that one a little bit.
Okay, so I had a business degree in college, and I took a lot of economic classes, and I learned a lot about socialism and Keynesianism.
Naturally.
So when I was looking for satisfying that free market urge I had, right, in college, the first book I turned to was Milton Friedman from the Chicago School of Economics. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, makes a great argument on why government actually interferes in the marketplace to the benefit of big business or big government and at the detriment of small business and the individual. I would highly recommend this book to people of all reading levels, but especially those that are interested in getting into economics.
All right. Well, thanks again for that one. I sometimes make it known, I try to have a sense of humor about this by saying that a mention of Austrian economics in a university classroom is more rare than a Bigfoot sighting. But I'm glad we're talking about it.
I didn't even know what it was, the School of Austrian Economics. I didn't even know what it was until probably about 6 years ago or so. And I had always known that I was a free market mind, but what really brought my attention to it, and I'll get to that in the next 2 books, is how money is handled by the federal government and the Federal Reserve.
Sure. Let me go next then. I'm going to recommend a book written by Tom Woods, who's a New York Times best-selling author. He's written other books on American history, like The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, which is excellent. This one is Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century. And Woods not only talks about the modern usage of nullification as it's used in some states today, predominantly to refute federal policy on marijuana and other things like that, but he goes from a historical angle where the Virginia Ratification Convention, like I mentioned earlier, was basically the roots of this theory, and it was not a new pragmatic theory as espoused by Jefferson and Madison. It was one consistent with what was said about the Constitution in the home states of the ratifiers. This is an excellent book which really outlines the recourse that states have to object to federal usurpation of power. And what that is that's when the federal government takes powers that it's not given. So that being said, this is particularly powerful. I know that you've read this one too, Jake.
It's a very good book. I've got a signed copy. I believe yours is signed as well.
Mine is signed as well. Jake was nice enough to get the author to sign it for me here, so thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a very brilliant mind.
You know what? Whenever I hear Wood speak, I am flabbergasted and kind of alarmed by the fact that I never think that I can get to be that intelligent, but he is fantastic.
Yeah.
The next one that you have is one by a radio host that we both sometimes listen to, so what about that one?
Yeah, I don't usually introduce him as a radio host, more as a economist and owner of a large investment advising firm. His name is Peter Schiff. Now, why this book is so important is it was written in 2006, and it was detailing the upcoming housing market crash. He almost detailed the problems of the crash to a T, and the reason he was able to do that was he understood the economic business cycle that the Austrian School of Economics talks about. Peter Schiff was doing multiple appearances on television and being laughed at and scorned through the financial media because he was talking about the housing market crash. And of course, he was 100% correct. And to this day, he's still scorned, and he's an outcast in the financial world because he makes bold predictions based on interest rates. And that's really where guys like myself and Austrian economists talk a lot about, is they talk about what happens when you manipulate interest rates, the impacts of that down the road.
Right, and he was mockingly maligned as being that of Dr. No. Is something that you actually alerted me to, and that's interesting. He did predict the housing bubble and decline in the markets, right?
Yeah, I think they called him Mr. Doom and Gloom or something like that because he took such a bearish position.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. My mistake.
And they'll call him a gold bull now as well. But he has very sound arguments, and it's real interesting to see the so-called solutions to the economic crash in 2008 just being the same thing basically that led to the housing crash. And Peter Schiff, like myself, talks a lot about what's coming up ahead of us.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for that. I will get to my last book here, and this is one of the books that really changed my mind, maybe more than almost any other book, and that is Tom DiLorenzo's The Real Lincoln. This book was written in about 2003, and once it was written, this guy was absolutely maligned, mocked, ridiculed for this book because it attacks the deified figure that we know of today as Abraham Lincoln. Well, little do most people know, Lincoln really went above and beyond to usurp constitutional powers in various ways. For instance, he worked to shut down over 300 northern newspapers. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland and arrested various legislators so they couldn't meet to secede from the Union. He arbitrarily deported a Northern Copperhead leader by the name of Clement Vallandigham just because he was a Copperhead leader that disagreed with conscription. So there's many things that DiLorenzo really writes about in here that a lot of people will never learn about Lincoln, and I found it particularly compelling. I know that you're interested in Lincoln too. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think I actually turned you on to that book, didn't I? By DiLorenzo, asking if you thought differently about Abraham Lincoln after reading that, and it does bring up some very good arguments that I think have been erased in our lessons of history.
Very much so. So let's get back to the last book that you brought in today, and this is a case for what we would all like to see our monetary value transition to, at least those that are up on this stage. So let's talk about that.
All right, staying on the topic of economics here. This is a very important book that not a lot of people talk about. It's called A Case for Gold. And the author, as you can see, is Ron Paul. Now, that probably gets a lot of people's interest, but it also turns people off from the subject because in some circles, Ron Paul's not very well liked. I would highly recommend this book for the very reason that I don't know of a better account of the history of money in the United States than this book. He spends an early part of this, actually it's not a very long book. It's the history of this was in in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan stood up a gold commission to see if we should go back to a gold standard, and Ron Paul was part of that team on making that case for gold. So that's the conclusion of that report. But he talks a lot about what has happened to the money system throughout the United States history, starting with the continental dollar, then transferring to the $20 Spanish coin, which was the most circulated coin at the time of our Constitution, to the greenback experiment during the Civil War, all the way till we started the Federal Reserve Bank, which was still under a gold standard for a certain point up to 1933, where it was arbitrarily lifted off of the $20 mark to $28. I might have those figures wrong, all the way up to the breakdown of Bretton Woods. So it's a very interesting story about the history of money in the United States, but why I say that's so important for people to understand is almost every transaction in the United States deals with money, right? So if half of your transaction is money, maybe you should understand that one transaction. What do I mean by that? Well, when you give money to somebody during a transaction, you usually want to know something about that product or service you're receiving. Everyone understands that concept, but how about the thing that you're giving up? Why don't we understand what that is? And so this is a great case and tells you what money is all about.
Fantastic. That's a very good read. And that was written in the 80s still, right?
This is the conclusion. I'm not sure if there's a second edition, but this was, yeah, it is. It's a second edition with Lou Rockwell Jr. Did the second edition. Sure. But anyhow, it's the report from the 1983 or whatever the year was, Gold Commission.
Fantastic. Just so the viewers are aware, these books, most of these books are on reading lists that we recommend to people in the North Metro that are interested in both economic and historical topics. You can find this list on youtube.com/East Metro Tea Party. It's part of a reading challenge that we've tried to incorporate to get more people interested in not only non-revisionary history, but Austrian economics and sound fiscal policy.
Yeah, and the challenge is if you read 10 of the 15 books, because we have one other guy with us, his name's Craig Schwartz. Craig has a list of 5 on just broad liberty topics, and he is willing to give someone 1 trillion or 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars or a silver ounce coin if they read 10 out of the 15 books on the list. And I think we got one bonus book, which was Nullification. So we'd open that up. I think you'd open up to anyone. So if you go to that link, youtube.com, East Metro Tea Party, you could find that book list.
Absolutely, and you have to bring your own wheelbarrow to carry all that Zimbabwe fiat.
It's just one bill. That's all.
Okay, all right. Well, fair enough. That being said, let's move on to the next topic. Remember, we're going to switch it up a little bit today and talk about another topic, which is very distinctly different from book reviews, and that is one of me and Jake's favorite pastimes, which is the NFL football. NFL football really is a big part of our hobbies and our interests, and I particularly wanted to have you on today also to discuss the changing dynamics of the NFC North, because as you are well aware, the NFC North seems like it's about completely opposite as it was 2 weeks ago even, for a variety of reasons. We're going to talk about that. This biased host today would like to talk about his own football squad, of course, so a recent development is such that Aaron Rodgers broke his collarbone. I wanted to display a YouTube video about that and kind of get the take of both me and Jake and what we think that has as far as ramifications for the division going forward. So let's plug up that YouTube video right now.
Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers left with a shoulder injury following the first series of Monday night's game against the Chicago Bears. Initial tests showed a minor collarbone fracture, and it looks like he will miss at least 3 weeks. He had completed just one pass to Jordy Nelson for 27 yards before exiting. Rodgers landed on his non-throwing shoulder when he was sacked by defensive end Shea McClellan. You can see here in the video that he goes down hard and struggles to get up. So how are the Packers going to deal with the quarterback situation now? Well, Seneca Wallace is the only other quarterback on the Packers' active roster and came into Monday night's game after Rodgers was sidelined. Before Monday, the 33-year-old had not played in a regular season game since 2011. The Packers could also sign...
All right, let's let's discuss this a little bit. This video came out prior to the Packers promoting a practice squad player named Scott Tolzien, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right now. That tells you how obscure this guy is that has filled in for Wallace. But this is a big deal for the Packers because Rodgers is one of the best players in the league and literally carries us, and we see a completely different Green Bay Packers right now. Given that, I wanted to ask you, Jake, do you think, given these changes, and try to have the most objective view as possible given this, I know you give the Packers respect when it's due, do you think the Packers still can win the NFC North given this?
Well, signing Matt Flynn could make a difference. Generally speaking, having a new quarterback signed to your team, it's not like you can just bring that guy on and he understands the offense. A good case in point was recently with the Vikings signing, it slipped my mind right now. Who did they sign?
Oh, Josh Freeman?
Oh, Josh Freeman, yeah.
Trade, yeah.
And Freeman came in and played a game and he looked horrible, didn't understand the offense. But Flynn actually was playing under that offense only, 2 or 3 years ago before he was signed by Seattle. And then he actually has some of the same personnel on that team. So the learning curve's a little quicker with Matt Flynn. So that could make a big difference, in my opinion. The Packers have a much easier schedule for the rest of the season than some of the other guys in the NFC North. But it's very hard for me to say this, being a Chicago Bears fan. My team is torn up too. I really like where Detroit is right now. Yeah. And I am crossing my fingers that Green Bay can take a game from Detroit, or both, and Detroit can lose out in games outside the division. That's my best prediction for the Bears having a chance going down the road. But right now it looks like Detroit's division to lose.
Yeah, I have to actually concur with the sentiments that you just espoused there. I would just add that, Flynn did look pretty good a few years ago, but he's been dropped by 3 teams within a very small time period. So to me, there kind of has to be something going on with him. But, I hold out hope. I will just make inference to the fact that you guys play the Lions this week, and I will probably say this to your benefit, is that I hope the Bears win that game.
No, we played Detroit last week, actually. So,
I'm sorry.
We lost that game.
I'm sorry, my bad.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would want us to win that game.
But I do agree with you that the Lions are the best positioned team to win. Their defensive line has been playing really well, and Megatron is playing better than he ever has. Calvin Johnson, who is playing incredibly well. Stafford looks pretty good too. So I really like how they're positioned.
And the pickup of Reggie Bush is huge. He fits in that offense very well. I wouldn't agree that Megatron's playing as good as he's ever done, but he's certainly contributed. But Pettigrew's a good target down the field. They have been without Burleson. I think he's out for the season. So
actually, I think Burleson might come back either this week or next week, actually.
Well, he's been out for a significant amount of time, but they've still played very well. So Detroit, it really is Detroit's division, I think, at this point to lose. So we'll see how they do outside the division. Chicago has got a new coach, first year, a new offensive and defensive coordinator. That's very difficult to start out playing well. Their defense is very seasoned at this point. Lance Briggs has been out for the last 3 weeks. Jake Cutler's been rocky. He came in last week. He probably shouldn't have. Our backup McCown's playing much better. The only good thing about Chicago is you've got great receivers, finally, after all these years, an offensive line that's blocking. But Matt Forte is still a rock star. And he's still playing very well. And Detroit had his number, and that's why they won the game. I would say Green Bay's got this thing that I've never seen. They've got a running back. And Lacey has been, he looks really good. So of all the seasons for Aaron Rodgers to get hurt, it has to be the season that they finally found out how to play a running game.
You have to bring that up, don't you? But that is true. Lacey can push the pile, and he is a powerhouse that we have not had since Amon Green. So I like him. I'll just answer my initial question by saying I don't think the Packers can win the division anymore. I hate to say and be a cynical naysayer about my own squad, but that's my realism, I guess. The Bears are banged up too, as you mentioned. Peanut Tillman might be gone for the year, close. Briggs is gone for an extended period. So it's really going to be interesting to see how things shake up in the next week or 2, 3 weeks ahead.
Yeah, I really think it's Detroit's division, and it's that. And, we did on this show, actually, with Tony, and then we had Sam on as well, and we did analysis of the NFC North. And I think a lot of our predictions sounded very good going into the injuries.
I agree.
And now
Yes.
it turns everything on its head. And that's the thing about the NFL is there's so many injuries, and it can just completely change that game.
Completely. And isn't that one of the most compelling reasons to follow the NFL is
Oh, yeah.
things can change on a whim, whereas, in baseball, you have so many games where, one game is not as significant, and in the NFL, it's really different.
But I would say about the NFL is that a quarterback generally is so significant of an injury that it overwhelms the team's other injuries. And good case in point here is Green Bay was still playing good football with Aaron Rodgers despite having injuries to Clay Matthews. Who else on your defense?
Cobb, Finley.
Yeah, I know your receiver core, but you also had
Nick Perry was gone
Nick
for a
Perry
long
was gone.
time. Casey Hayward's going to be gone for an extended time
Right.
now. We've had some serious injuries, too.
But until Aaron Rodgers was out, it looked like you guys still had a season.
You're right.
And you guys actually won the Super Bowl 5 years back with a pretty injured squad going into the playoffs.
3 years back, come on.
3 years.
You want to relegate us to a position of the distant past when we won. I'm just kidding. But
Yeah, coming from a Bears fan, I'm still living in 1985 and 1986.
That being said, let's just move on a little bit from the NFC North here by talking about just two brief topics from the rest of the league that I know that you'll have an opinion on. We discuss issues like this all the time, whether on public access television or not. But the first question I want to ask you, Jake, is there is one of the biggest games of the season coming up this Sunday night in Denver between the Denver Broncos, who have one loss in the season, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who have no losses and are undefeated. I'd like to hear what your take is on that game, who you think's going to be the winner, and just give a brief analysis of it.
Well, being in the same division, they'll play each other twice in this season, but this one happens to fall at Mile High Stadium, and that's very well known in the league as a tough place to play because of the altitude, and a pretty good home field advantage as far as crowd noise goes. So I like Denver's chances a little bit better for those factors. I also say when you look at the two teams comparatively speaking, I think Denver's a better team. The receiving core in Denver's phenomenal. Peyton Manning, this far in his career, is still playing at a high caliber. Their running game is very well managed, but that's amongst 2 to 3 backs in a game.
Yeah.
Their defense is pretty good.
Yeah.
Kansas City, to me, is being well coached, but they've got Dwayne Bowe, a fantastic receiver, but they're not there like Denver is, and so I would put Denver on top of them in this game.
I generally concur. Some people are picking the Chiefs for the upset, but I think you have to consider a few factors. And the first is that the Chiefs' schedule has actually been very, very, soft. It's been very soft in comparison. They've actually played 3 straight teams with, I think, first start rookie quarterbacks or something at one point. But that's not to take away from the Chiefs. That defense is legitimate. That defense is for real. They're making plays. They have a lot of talent. And Jamal Charles is running fantastically. He's been incredibly consistent this year. Andy Reid is coaching the team very well. They're not passing the ball down the field, so I worry that they can catch up to Denver. I think Denver could actually pick this team apart. I picked Denver to win by a decent margin, and you're right to make the notion, or to make the note that the Denver receivers are maybe one of the best cores that I've ever seen on an NFL team.
Yeah, certainly the best Peyton Manning's ever had, and he's had Harris. No. What's his name?
Yeah, Marvin Harrison.
Marvin Harrison.
You're right.
Screwing up here. Real professional here. And Reggie Wayne on the same team, and Dallas Clark. So, you put that together with how good Peyton Manning is and how much defensive backfields have very little impact on top-tier quarterbacks. It's Denver's game to lose. Now, I will say this. The most important part of a defense in today's modern passing game against a top-tier quarterback is getting pressure on the quarterback. You will not disrupt Peyton Manning unless you get to him. He is a pocket passer. He's not Aaron Rodgers, not mobile, and it's a lot of credit to Aaron Rodgers in the fact he's one of the most sacked quarterbacks in the league and still has those numbers. if Peyton Manning was being rushed and sacked as much as Aaron Rodgers, I would not see those stats being there.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Let's move on to our last topic when it comes to the NFL today. Let's just talk briefly about the MVP race. There's a few players that are going above and beyond to produce this year in the NFL, and I want to get your take on who do you think, without knowing like the exact specifics of the stats, who is your take on who's the MVP? Let's just take a minute and I'll make my answer.
Once again, Peyton Manning's in that discussion. I think he's probably on pace to break the passing yardage per season. But as usual, Drew Brees is right behind. And Drew Brees is always up there on stats.
Yes.
And he's got a phenomenal guy, and I think you'll probably talk about him as a tight end who's in the conversation. Another name out there, LaShawn McCoy, fantastic season. This guy is an incredible threat both on the ground but also in the passing game, and especially with a team that's had a injury to their starting quarterback. So I think those three names would be in the conversation.
Sure, fair enough. Like you said, yeah, Peyton Manning does have a rightful claim to be considered, certainly, if not only in the conversation, to be the front runner. But I will go with the guy that you made inference to, and that is Jimmy Graham, who's the tight end of the New Orleans Saints. And Graham is having a phenomenal season as well. He's on pace to shatter the tight end records for record number of touchdowns and yards as well, and he really is contributing to their victories. I know that most of the MVP discussion revolves around quarterbacks, and for good reasons. Quarterbacks are the most effectual position in the NFL today.
Yeah.
But I think Jimmy Graham certainly deserves some conversation in that mix. So
yeah, he's looking to be one of the best tight ends I've seen in the game.
Yeah, definitely.
And this new trend of phenomenal college basketball players going to the NFL and having successful careers in the tight end position. It's just another one of that line.
Absolutely. All right, let's go back to another issue of more important ideological connotations, and that is that you are very involved in the spreading of the Tea Party groups that are in the Metro system. You are one of the leaders of the Tea Party Political Action Committee, with Mr. Rogers that we are both well acquainted with, but you also help run a lot of the organizations and a lot of the events. I want you to tell me, Jake, what is the biggest change and biggest transition that's occurred in the Tea Party in the metro area in the last year? Just give us a few things that have happened in the last year.
Sure. Just to go back a little bit further where the Tea Party movement started, it really spurred off of the financial crisis and watching what the Republicans were doing and the president was doing, abandoning the notion of free markets and fiscal responsibility. It really spurred that Tea Party movement. Then you have the 2008 election, terrible choices on the Republican side, a horrible choice on the Democrat side, which ushered in this era of progressives that basically run Washington, D.C. And the Tea Party is really the conscience of, I shouldn't say the Republican Party, but the conservative part of the Republican Party, so to speak, although it brings a lot more other people in the fold. Well, the Tea Party was credited with huge victories in 2010, both here in the state of Minnesota and nationally. And 2012 rolled around, and people thought the movement had died. And to a certain degree, it had kind of withered away. But there were some successful Tea Parties still occurring here in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. One of them was the North Metro Tea Party that was organized by Jack Rogers and a couple other good patriots. And I talked to Jack back in January, and I said, we need to duplicate what we're doing here, the fun, enjoyable atmosphere that's also teaching people stuff. So what we did is we started the East Metro Tea Party, and you were with me on that one.
Of course.
And we wanted to keep the message to the principles and stay pretty much on those principles of free markets, fiscal responsibility, and constitutional limited government. After the East Metro's huge success, we developed a toolkit, and we took that toolkit and we went around the Twin Cities and built 5 more chapters. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We've gone to the state fair. We are now producing a magazine with great authors as yourself. And we are just trying to build a big alliance of people that focus on those free markets, fiscal responsibility, and constitutional limited government principles that the conservative movement and the Tea Party movement embrace.
Sure. I have been delighted to speak regularly at the East Metro Tea Party and at other times various other Tea Parties like the North Metro, and I'm delighted every time that I get comments saying, we really appreciate how you get into the constraints of the Constitution, which our politicians often forget. And that's the thing that gives me the most apprehension about the political system. And I've been glad to make your acquaintance and help out in that. I think that what you gentlemen are doing has been broadly effectual, and really the media doesn't seem to really catch on to this, do they? It doesn't seem like...
You're surprised?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily surprised, but it seems like the Tea Party in Minnesota is actually bigger than it's ever been, but there's not much notation of that. Is that accurate? Or?
Yeah, I think 2010 had a lot of people inside the ranks. What we're going to do is we're going to build that back up, and we're having a lot of success early on. But I think until you have some kind of political win, you achieve something politically, you'll be ignored. And so at this point, it's been untested in as far as those goals go. So we'll see legislative victories in 2014 or a political election victory in 2014. Might bring the media back and actually report a little bit more about what we're doing.
Interesting. That being said, besides those potential realities that may unfold, what, in your estimation, is the future of the Minnesota Tea Party? Where can it go from here? Can it expand outside of the metro? What do you see happening? How do you see people getting involved? What can people do?
People need to go to TeaParty.MN, and I think the website's right under my name here. You can learn about what we're doing here in the state of Minnesota. Become a member, get your magazine. If you're a business, join our Tea Party Business Alliance. That's the big thing. As far as, is it just going to be Minnesota? We'll leave the borders, yes. We want to do that eventually at some point. But we need to test what we're doing here in Minnesota. We're really doing something that's never been done, politically speaking. Jack and I are not great political minds, or we don't at least approach problems from a political standpoint. We approach it from a business standpoint. So that's how we're really developing the Business Alliance. Now, we do have a political action committee in the state of Minnesota, and we do plan to intervene into these races. However, the way that we approach the building of this grassroots movement is really from a business approach, not so much from a political approach. And so it's untested, and once we see success from this, we hope to go talk to Wisconsin and Ohio and Alaska and New Hampshire. We want to go talk to these people and tell them what's working here in Minnesota. Because, by the way, a lot of people think Minnesota's a liberal state, and if we could win here in Minnesota, people will want to listen to what we're doing.
Sure, fair enough. Just one thing, just before we move on here, what I'll say is that one of the most appealing aspects of autonomous groups that meet, like the Tea Parties, is that there's philosophical aims that you just don't get in the mainstream Washington economic discussions, debates, etc. when it comes to, the state, tyranny versus liberty. Those types of situations are almost never drawn into modern conversation, and that's what I appreciate. So, that being said, any final words about the Tea Party?
Well, let me just comment off that real quick. A lot of people look at politics and they say, well, this is Democrat and this is Republican, or this is liberal and this is conservative. And the way that we break it down is this is government growing under either party and this is liberty shrinking under either party. And so when you put things in perspective that way, you bring in new people to the fold, that you get people's interest. But the way I define a Tea Party activist or a Tea Partier is that person that's had a light bulb go off in their head and that says that liberty is shrinking, that the government is doing something to me that's imposing upon my freedom. And that could be as simple as I'm a farmer and my wetland is now, or my cropland is now designated as a wetland by the EPA and they're fining me $20,000 a day. Or it could be the mom who's got 5 children and has their own licensed practice daycare at her house, and now she's being told she's being unionized because of what the DFL did in the state.
Right.
So there's various reasons I bring people to the Tea Party movement, but what we want to make people understand is that it's not really a Democrat or Republican thing. It's big government versus individual liberty.
And I agree with you. I think that too many people do obsess on the left-right paradigm, where that is really not really the best way of looking at most issues. So that being said, let's again divert, switching it up again to another hobby-based topic. We're just going back and forth here. So lighten the mood, maybe some more dismal aspects when we talk about Washington and the federal government. But right now, let's move into UFC 167, which takes place tonight. Myself and the co-host here will be joining each other at a local watering hole to watch this event. And I particularly wanted to focus on two of the biggest fights at the top of this card. One of them, and it's perfect that you're here today, because one of them involves your favorite fighter, none other than the real American Chael Sonnen. He goes against Rashard Evans, who's kind of been a little shaky lately. This is a big light heavyweight fight, just for the notoriety involved in both those individuals. I know Chael's your favorite, so I want to get your take on this. Where do you see this fight going? What do you think is going to happen?
Okay, well, Chael is, he's probably my favorite fighter. He's certainly my favorite personality in the octagon. Chael has jumped up back to light heavyweight more recently. That is, in my opinion, one of the greatest talent pools in the UFC, and I think it gets overlooked in a lot of discussions. You have a couple guys with just like one or two losses, and Rashard Evans is one of them. He lost to John Bone Jones, the current light heavyweight champion, a guy that seems almost unbeatable. The only guy that even really came close recently was Alexander Gustafsson, who had a very impressive bout, but lost in the end. So, and then Rashard Evans lost to Nogueira, and Nogueira is a phenomenal athlete, been around forever. So those were his only two losses, I think, in his MMA career, certainly in the UFC. So Chael Sonnen is going to test his abilities versus a former light heavyweight champion, Rashard Evans, and a guy that's lost very few fights. Now, generally speaking, people would say, well, Chael Sonnen is the underdog. However, Chael just did the same thing to a Brazilian fighter who was almost as highly touted as Rashard Evans, former light heavyweight champion. His name was Shogun Rua, and he beat him via guillotine choke in the first round. So there's a speculation. Maybe Chael is as good as most of the talent pool in the UFC light heavyweight division. My only problem is I don't believe Chael will ever get another shot at John Bones Jones. He lost his one chance, and so where does he have to go but back down to 185 and fight at middleweight?
I agree with you that light heavyweight to me is the most talented class, and largely with what you said, I think that, Chael's sure done pretty darn well against the best talent in the entire UFC, perhaps. So I actually will pick him to win tonight. I think that he can win, although I'm not sure of it. But yeah, I mean, if for nothing else, the press conference after a Chael Sonnen victory would be fantastic. So yeah, that's that's my reasoning, I guess.
It's not as interesting of a fight as a lot of the fights. Chael really, he gets his name from fighting and trash talking Brazilian fighters, and it's hilarious. He calls himself the American gangster or bad boy, and it's good entertainment. And I don't generally like trash talkers, but the guy gets in the octagon and he performs. Chael's going to come out tonight, and he is going to put the pressure on Rashard Evans, okay? I don't know if he's going to get the takedown right off the bat. He generally gets the takedown in guys that are very prone to that. Chael is one of the best wrestlers in the UFC, in modern MMA. He can take guys to the ground and then do the ground and pound, get the gloves in the guy's face and get over his airways, make the guy uncomfortable, put the pressure and the poundage on top of him. So if he does that to Rashard Evans, he's in very good position. Rashard Evans is a fantastic stand-up artist, and he's also got a good takedown defense. So if this thing stays on the feet, I don't like Chael Sonnen's chances too much.
Sure.
But I wouldn't say that he's out of luck. But I would say that Rashard Evans is going to probably emerge victorious if that's the case.
Fair enough. Interesting take. So that being said, let's talk about the fight that's at the top of the card, and this is a very highly anticipated fight.
Oh, big time.
There is a longtime champion who's one of the biggest names in the entire sport that's going against an up-and-comer who is really a bruiser. If this guy connects, he can literally knock your socks off. And let's just look at a short video clip where a UFC fighter kind of delves into this fight and what can happen. And that fighter's Josh Koscheck, and he's going to say who he thinks is going to win. So let's take a look at that video right now.
The main event, Hendricks and St. Pierre, definitely is interesting. Definitely George is going to use his wrestling. When it comes to play this fight, Johnny Hendricks is a good wrestler. He's a couple-time NCAA champion. Collegiately, he's one of the best wrestlers. They come out of college.
Oh! Just like that! That's the big left hand again!
I think that Johnny Hendricks' only punching chance would be, in the first or second round. After that, I believe that George St. Pierre is going to use his jab and use his speed and take advantage of Hendricks, later in the rounds. You got to understand that the experience of fighting 25 minutes comes into play in this game.
Championship rounds!
St. Pierre has fought numerous fights at 25 minutes.
The thing we're seeing about George St. Pierre is he's getting better.
George St. Pierre definitely will use his speed. George St. Pierre will use his jab and control the distance and pick John Hendricks apart.
All right, so we got a little taste of that. Let's just discuss this between ourselves as well. I tend to agree with the analysis of Koscheck there. I think that if the fight goes beyond 2 rounds, it's hard for me not to think that St. Pierre will win because of his wrestling ability and his jab. And he's a very smart fighter that doesn't take any unnecessary risk usually, although his last few fights have been pretty bruising actually. But like he made mention to, Hendricks is a bruiser and he can knock you out at any time. So what's your thoughts, Jake?
Koscheck's right about the experience in a 5-round fight. For those people that watch the show that don't know a lot about UFC, it's generally just title fights that go for 5-minute rounds. Otherwise, most fights are 3 5-minute rounds. That's a complete difference in how your game plan is developed. And experience matters a lot in that kind of system. And GSP, being the title holder, has had a lot of experience with 5-round bouts. Hendricks not as many, if any. I can't even recall one. So that's the one thing I'd say. Conditioning-wise, don't ever think that Hendricks is behind GSP on that. Now, GSP is a phenomenal athlete, one of the greatest physiques in fighting, one of the greatest talents, a fantastic martial artist. And even though this isn't his history, he has become known as one of the greatest wrestlers in the game, or in the business. But Johnny Hendricks has got the one thing that GSP doesn't have. He has got the sickest left punch that I've seen, he's a southpaw punch I've ever seen in that low of a weight division. In fact, some people would say he's the pound-for-pound best puncher in the UFC.
Yeah, we saw it on that video clip too, by the way. That was pretty immaculate. But
and I don't think GSP has faced a guy even anywhere close to that with that kind of threat. And so I think that's going to be troublesome for GSP because his game isn't taking him to the ground because he's fighting just as good a wrestler. So the stand-up is really, can he get those jabs in, keep that distance, use kicks effectively, and neutralize Hendricks' one knockout punch?
I agree. That'll be fun to watch tonight for both of us. If I have to render an opinion as far as who I think will win that fight, I will have to say St. Pierre, and I can definitely see the other side of this coin for many of the reasons that you mentioned. I do think that Hendricks, I would not like to make that guy mad whatsoever because of his knockout power. But I have to pick St. Pierre just because it just seems like he is one of the most efficient and consistent fighters, and I think that his ground game is vastly superior, which I don't think you would disagree with, right?
Hendricks' ground game is on par with it. I mean, he's just as good a wrestler as George St. Pierre. The difference is the stand-up game. GSP is the better fighter. I'm going to go with actually Hendricks on that. Not just to be contrarian here. I really believe this is, and here's what I've predicted. I predicted that Pettis would beat Bendo. I predicted that Weidman would beat Silva, and I predicted all 3 of the Dos Santos and Velasquez fights. So I'm batting 5 for 5 in these
You're very humble, too.
major title fights. So I am predicting for the 6th one here that there will be another upset, and I think GSP's reign at the top will come to an end tonight with Johnny Hendricks knocking him out.
It could. We've seen bigger upsets. I mean, both of us, I think, watched Matt Serra beat GSP at one point. So, and that would have been probably a bigger surprise at that time. So it very well could happen. I'm really intrigued at this card for sure. Let's move on to another topic, and this is near and dear to my heart. You know that this is one of my favorite topics to speak about. I'm currently writing a book in which this is a big part of the book, and the tradition that built upon this topic made the United States basically revert back to its original roots that were inherent in the ratification conventions, and it's a topic that Jefferson and Madison supported, and that is the notion of nullification. Sure. And you're well aware of it, so we're going to get your take too. I would just say that nullification is a state as a constituent body to the building blocks of the Union, and that is the Constitution. That is the state right to nullify law. And what that means is when the federal government goes beyond its bounds in assuming powers that it was never given in the Constitution, that it is the states as the sovereign body to determine the constitutionality of that measure and whether it can even be enforced in its state. This is a notion which Thomas Jefferson considered the rightful remedy in opposing usurpation of federal powers, and James Madison wrote in the Virginia Resolutions of 1798 that it was necessary for arresting the progress of evil. That's James Madison's words. So this is a serious issue. When it's brought up today, it's mostly associated with deplorable causes. But let's take a look at one of the foremost experts of this topic and the author of the book that I talked about earlier, Tom Woods. He's going to talk a little bit about this principle and what it means. So let's play Woods' video here.
Created, namely the federal government, should go beyond the powers granted to it by the sovereign peoples of the states, then the very logic of the system demands that the sovereign peoples of the states, by virtue of being sovereign, have to have a last resort mechanism for intervening when their own system perverts its instrument, namely the Constitution.
The 10th Amendment defines the entire scope of federal power as that which we, the people of the several states, gave to it in the Constitution, and nothing more.
The 10th Amendment was sort of taken to be implicit in the Constitution even before it was included with the Bill of Rights, and it simply means that the federal government has only the powers that are delegated to it, and the states and the people retain the remainder. And if you look at the state ratifying conventions where the states decided whether or not to ratify the Constitution, there you see that one after the other they were being assured that even without the 10th Amendment, the Constitution as drafted already implicitly contained this idea.
I sued the federal government based on the 10th Amendment.
All right, let's just discuss that a little bit here. So basically, that is a compelling argument. Woods is one of the best speakers on this. You saw a 10th Amendment Center. The person who made the 10th Amendment Center, Michael Bolden, talk about it as well. Why do you think nullification is particularly compelling, Jake, and useful and essential in today's day and age?
For so many reasons, but let's just take the big one, the elephant in the room inside the Republican-Democrat parties. We have this monstrosity known as Obamacare, okay? And the current fight against Obamacare was brought all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and many people in the Republican-conservative realm were waiting for the decision and hoping that they would act in the favor of the states and the people thereof. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, as they've done many times throughout history, did not side on liberty or side on the Constitution.
Right.
Instead, sided with big government, and they said Obamacare was constitutional based on the taxing privileges of Congress. A horrible argument, but we won't get into it. The point here is, if we are to believe that we are sovereign states and we have the ultimate right to say, no, this is not the law of the land, not in the state boundaries. And so that's why I think the principles of nullification is very important when it comes to a bill that is so atrocious like Obamacare, that's causing millions of jobs, which is leading to a lower work week, which is leading to people having cancellations of their health care. If we don't nullify this at the state level, we could not rely on the federal government to act accordingly.
I think you're right, and I think that was very well stated, Jake. I think one of the things that I like to talk about when I discuss these issues in public speaking and other places is that a lot of the things, the tenets that nullification is based on, people don't know what it was basically implemented to oppose in its earliest days, particularly in 1798. As we know, and I know that you're aware of this, is that in 1798, the John Adams Federalist Administration and the Federalist Congress at the time passed a set of 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act was the most condemnable, which penalized people for speaking so much as a common criticism against the President of the United States, members of Congress, and civil officers. In fact, the only government official in the federal government that you could lawfully criticize was that of the vice president, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson at the time, the leader of the Republicans at that time. Now, this is essential because people were literally jailed. Over 20 people were tried, and I think the number is 10 were convicted for just levying common criticisms against the president. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson thought this was deplorable and associated it with that of a monarchy. So because of that, they said that, the Constitution doesn't have, the federal government doesn't have the ability to take powers that the Constitution never granted to it. So since Virginia and Kentucky, who they both wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions for and were adopted by their legislatures, made known that those laws aren't enforceable. So that's a powerful notion to me. The last thing before I'll let you chime in on this is today, again, people associate nullification with deplorable causes like slavery, but it was never used to oppose slavery because the federal government never passed any measure that took away slave power or impeded slave rights. In fact, the federal government was fairly complicit with the expansion of slavery because of the popular sovereign doctrine that was espoused and supported by people like Stephen Douglas. So do you have any response to that, or what else? How else do you think that can be used?
I think nullification is a very important part about the way we look at government and governance in the United States. And this is really the principles of our founding fathers. We need to keep power as close or as local as possible. In order to keep that power, you have to, at the local level, you have to be able to reject laws that are infringing on rights at the higher level. So it's the really basic nature of how the founders and how really the modern Tea Party and conservative movement views governance. I like to use this point. We have a very slim chance, if our rights are being abused, of ever getting to a bureaucrat or legislator in Washington, D.C., and ever influencing them. But if your rights are being abused at the local level, you have a far better chance going and talking to your city council member or your mayor, because we probably live in a neighborhood right next to them. So let's keep it at the most local level, and nullification is pretty much right in line with that principle.
That's right, and I think that if more local legislators were knowledgeable in this, we would have a lot less problems that we do in the federal government. So that being said, let's just wrap up a little bit today by talking about what is in store for the future. I know that Tony will be back here next week to talk to Senate candidate Chris Dahlberg, U.S. Senate candidate. Have you ever gotten a chance to meet Chris? Or?
He came and spoke at the East Metro Tea Party, and he showed up at the end at the North Metro Tea Party, and I think he had a table and met some of the people. But other than that, that's about as much as I've seen of Chris Dahlberg.
Sure.
But I think there's about 4 or 5 people right now currently vying for Al Franken's position.
Sure.
I would say all 5 are probably going to be a lot better than Al Franken. But let's get the most conservative choice person that wants to actually fight out in Washington, D.C. for the state of Minnesota.
That's right. I mean, it's really interesting how some of the local elections are kind of developing here. There's many people that are running for office. We heard Tom Emmer speak the other night, and he's going to be running for the 6th district seat that will be vacated by Michelle Bachmann. So there's a lot of interesting things coming up. Me and Jake, after we depart from here, will watch that that fight later tonight. There's some things going on in Washington too. In fact, the Federal Reserve is about to nominate a new chairwoman. Is that the right way to say it? Is that Yellen looks to be nominated soon, so that's going to be a battle. Let's just wrap it up there by telling you that, Tony Hernandez usually gives some of his second language to depart from the show, so I'll do the same by giving you some Mandarin. Ju ni hao. I wish everyone well. Hui tou jian. See you next time. Thank you, everyone. Woo.